Hello, feisty people. Welcome to the Women's Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Sara Gross, and over the next few weeks, we will be counting down to the Olympic Games in Paris with a special series called Croissants and Commentary, Moments on the Road to Paris. Every week for the next 9 weeks, I will be joined by sports reporter and head of content here at Feisty Media, Kelly O'Mara. Kelly and I will unpack all things Olympics. We will talk to athletes, coaches, and other experts about everything from peak performance to nutrition, delivering you all the hype every week. Then, once the Olympic Games begin, we will be recording daily podcasts live from Paris with all the behind-the-scenes info. While we regrettably cannot share our Parisian croissants, we can and will share our feisty commentary. So, pull up a chair, grab an espresso, and let us take you to Paris with us. Hi, Kelly. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to finally be recording this episode. I've been bugging you for how long? Like a month and a half to do an episode about the state of women's sports. So I'm so excited.
You like basically since what women's sports got big. We've been saying we were going to do this.
Wait, women's sports got big. Quick, let's record a podcast. This is the very first episode of an amazing podcast series that Kelly and I are doing called Croissants and Commentary, Moments on the Road to Paris. And our first episode today is all about basically the changing landscape of women's sports. It's exciting.
Yeah. Times. I feel like we picked moments, right? Because the whole thing is that this isn't a moment. This is a movement, right? This is not just
it's like your shirt says.
Like my shirt. If you can't, wait, I always say this is a podcast. You can't see what we're doing on video, but it's like my shirt. It's not a moment. It's a movement. But movements are made up of moments. And there are a lot of those happening right now. Many of them.
Many of them. It's funny to me because I've a couple times in the last month, I've said to people, oh yeah, like there's a big inflection point in women's sports. There's this huge tailwind in the market,
Tailwind, nice.
Tailwind in the market. I picked that up from my, when I was talking to people about investing in Feisty Media, and there's a tailwind in the market, and I use that. But then a lot of people would say to me, oh yeah, thank you, Caitlin Clark. And I'm I'm like, well, yes, but also, my head's about to explode because I realize there's so many moments and so many things that have been happening in women's sports for, going back even 100 years that have kind of continued to lead it to grow women's sports and lead us to this time where suddenly it's becoming mainstream and people are watching women's sports in their living rooms on a Sunday afternoon.
And I feel Caitlin Clark, right? I get it. She has gone mainstream. I appreciate anyone who goes mainstream. Mm-hmm. And I also appreciate that, oh my God, how tough must it be for a 22-year-old to be carrying the weight of the expectations of every female athlete in the country on her, right? But to say that it's the Caitlin Clark effect is so unbelievably simplistic and minimizing. Because like you said, even if you just go back in history in women's basketball, they said the same thing about Candace Parker. They said the same thing about Cheryl Swoops, about Cheryl Hines. Why am I losing her name? Anyway, Diana Taurasi. You see these quotes that are game changer, gonna bring women's basketball into the mainstream. And it's not like they aren't really good players. Mm-hmm. It's not like the WNBA doesn't have amazing players. As you can see now, Caitlin Clark is playing in WNBA and getting, not to say getting her ass kicked, but there are very, very good players. The problem was there wasn't the infrastructure, the media, the coverage, the press, that there wasn't all this other stuff around them. So you can have these really good players and they're just going to exist in a vacuum unless people know about it.
Totally. And I also think, if we're looking back, one of the major moments for women's sports is around tennis.
Sure.
Right. And Billie Jean King, and how tennis was way before its time in terms of creating an independent women's game that now stands on its own. I think they just recently actually got equal prize money, and they're just way ahead of every other sport.
Yeah, it was 1970 that the 9 of them decided to boycott the US Open because they weren't offering equal prize money, and they struck out on their own. And can you imagine now, if 9 athletes, even to think about a sport we talk about, running or cycling or triathlon, if 9 athletes were we're going to boycott and go start our own thing, it would be so hard to do. And so it's amazing, different time, sports were a lot smaller then. Mm-hmm. So it's and there was only 5 channels on TV. So it's easier to be like, there's nothing else to do on a Saturday than watch tennis. So it's easier to like monopolize that conversation, right? But it is so impressive. And even to this day, the highest paid female athletes in the world are tennis players. And that is because they got like a 3-decade head start on like every other sport,
Yeah. So in terms of this particular moment or this particular movement that we're like, this inflection point that we're seeing right now, like, why do you think it's happening?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, like you said, there are these other things that have happened that got us here, right? Like you said, like tennis was the groundbreaking pivotal at one point. Women's soccer is particularly like US women's soccer really paved the way. And in like modern era, I think there's an amount where like women's US soccer really paved the way for a lot of other sports too, like fighting the good fight, filing like the federal complaint for equal pay, because then other countries could look to them and model how they did it. And then even like when you talk about the hockey league, when when US women's hockey decided that they were also going to boycott and protest over equal pay, they went to the soccer team, the soccer players, and were like, how did you do it?
Right.
And
I remember that.
Yeah. And then they use that model to do it themselves. So there's something where like soccer, like those women really, really actually like had this like far reaching effect, which of course came like after Title IX, which then meant you had a whole generation that finally grew up, right, expecting equal access. And then those women get to college, right? Like, so you have to have all those things. You have to have an entire generation that has always been able to play, and then they become adults. And then they have kids, and then their kid, like, and then to their kids, they've never known it. Like their parents have never known a time when they couldn't play sports. So their kids are like, "What the fuck are you talking about? Women were banned for running." So I think that it's hard. Like I said to somebody, I was like, "Oh, well, this is really like the first generation that's like super post Title IX," and they were like, "Title IX is 50 years old." I was like, "No, but like think about it. Like my mom was alive when women weren't allowed to race longer than 1.5 miles.
Yeah, that's wild.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, and granted, like, it's not like she, like, my mom, you've all met my mom. My mom was never going to be like, you can't do things, Kelly, of course. But that means like when I was playing soccer, I was the only girl on the co-ed team as a kid, right? So like those, it takes a while. It takes like generations for that to change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think let's talk about media a bit, because I'm thinking like, because right now, okay, we're seeing women's sports more on mainstream media, right? But I think one thing, and this is, I'm just like really, my high horse right now is really like, we cannot forget who came before us in this moment, right? So I think like one thing that is pivotal for women's sports is kind of social media, the growth of social media, and kind of like that democratization of media. We're going to talk about that in terms of social media. So like anybody can make an account. You can watch whatever you want. You can put whatever you want on social media. Right. And I think part of what happened there was there were enough people who were like, oh no, actually, like we do want to watch women's sports. Right. And you have all these social media accounts coming out, and it essentially ended up being the testing ground for like, oh yeah, actually people will watch. People are interested in this. And this huge conversation built online. First,
right?
There
weren't as many gatekeepers, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so now it's like sort of coming into the mainstream, right? But that didn't just change overnight. Like that was tried and proofed through social. Proofed. It's the official word. Through like social, like the proof of concept, I guess is what I mean. Like through social media, content creation, and people actually watching it.
Yeah, because like, I mean, I was kind of making fun of like there were 5 TV channels before, but like there were. And so what got to go on those 5 channels was decided almost always by men, almost always by white 55-year-old men, which is still who makes a lot of decisions. But that has changed, because now there's just, it's not like those white 55-year-old men are still making most of the decisions at the TV stations, but like the possibilities have changed, right? Like you can start your own media company. You could call it Feisty if you want, for example.
And you could cover women's sports.
Right.
People will watch things and listen to things.
And then when you go to like investors and decision makers or gatekeepers, you can say, look, this random fan held up a phone in the stands at a WNBA game and got 800,000 views, which happened like a couple weeks ago. Why don't you put that shit on TV? which I know was like, I know that specific example, there was like whatever issues with the scheduling and mistakes were made. But to your point, it's like they can see that like massive followings on Instagram, massive followings on Twitter or TikTok, or people can make their own videos, and then it's like, oh wait, we're missing out here. So
yeah, exactly.
And so I do think one of the things that's changed a lot, and we're like, we were just talking about tennis, soccer, and now it's like basketballs. Basketball is the one that's at the forefront now.
In North America, basketball is the number one women's sports right now. I just want to be super clear about that too, because it's like soccer and tennis are still, or football, I should say, and tennis are still the biggest sports for women elsewhere in the world, right? But here in North America, basketball.
And it's really driving the conversation now, right? And it's like, why is that? And then people want to be like, oh, it's Caitlin Clark. But it's like, it's because you could see Caitlin Clark on TV. Like, because you didn't have to like know about some secret Instagram account that like, right? Like you didn't have to be like super in the weeds in the know. You could just like turn on ABC and see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get all these, and like you said, you go, how many cocktail parties have you been at lately where some guy's like, it's amazing, Caitlin Clark. I mean, she plays like a guy I was watching and she plays so good. And you're like, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do have, but it is the media, it is the attention. And it took that didn't come on accident, right? The NCAA got reamed for not investing in women's sports, for not investing in the tournament. Like there was that massive report that came out because of the inequality. And then there was realized that they were losing, they were told and shown they were losing a lot of money, right? And only then did they allow the women to even call it March Madness. Did they invest? Did they put it on TV? Right? Only then did the TV deal, the structure of TV deals change so that the women's tournament wasn't just like this sad stepchild.
Yeah. It's interesting when I hadn't really thought about this until you were till we're talking just now, but like, it's just an interesting intersection of things that happened there, right? Like remember Sedona Prince and that video of like the women's, like it was basically like a rack of dumbbells. That was the women's like strength and conditioning for the for one of the NCAA teams, I think.
For the tournament.
For the tournament. And then it was like, and then the men's weight room. And it was just like this massive, like pimped out weight room. Yeah. Right. And like, I think like everything from that to like, that was only what?
That was in 4 years ago.
4 years ago? Yeah. It wasn't that long ago, right?
No.
Then you take the fact that like, because of Title IX, like I draw right back to Title IX to 1972, where like actually not providing equal weight room access is technically illegal.
It is, yeah.
And so it's like this, you have to make something illegal, right? You have to have social media to get people riled up about something, right? True. And then you have to have someone somewhere willing to take a risk and put women's sports on TV. And then like, it was just already, it was like basically the NCAA March Madness tournament was in a place, it was just like ready to explode.
It was ready. It was ready. Yeah.
It was primed.
And then it became a thing, right? And then once it's a thing, everyone's like, well, did you watch the game? Did you watch the game? And then of course, everyone's going to watch it because I mean, I'm literally like texting my parents, my family, like, did you watch the game? And you don't have to say which game. And then it's like, of course, then it'll take off. Like once you hit that inflection point. Yeah, you like that. But there's also, what was her name? Sabrina Prince's video. Sedona, thank you.
Yeah.
Then did prompt a whole investigation. And then there was a whole report commissioned that was like, oh, actually the NCAA massively was not just like the way the deal was structured with like how they sold TV rights for the men's tournament and then how they bundled all of the rest of the sports together, right? Massively undervalued. And then they also like, because of that deal, then all the rights for like the term March Madness and all of the there's specific requirements on like what you have to show and how much money has to get spent in advertising and like all this stuff is very specified and it just like wasn't there for the women. And so then it's like, well, of course nobody's watching. You didn't tell them when the fucking game was, right? Like, how are they going to know? Like, that's not possible.
Totally.
So we actually have our own basketball game coming up. And so we did talk to one of those players. We are going to the what is it? The final send-off Olympic game for Team Canada. We're going to set a national record.
Yes. So the senior women's basketball team for Team Canada is playing right here in Victoria, which is where Feisty HQ is. And the game is called Whoop It Up. And we're trying to like basically set a record for attendance for a national team women's
home game. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we were playing Portugal in their final game before the Olympics. And so I talked to one of the players, Shay Colley, who played in college, plays overseas, has been on the team for a few years now, about like why it's so different now. Like why is it having a moment? And she kind of said a lot of the same things I think we're feeling.
I think it's being brought to the attention. It's played more on television, or you see clips on social media. You also see other stars going to support the women's game, if it's NCAA or WNBA. So I think that's why it's on the rise and you see more of it.
And I think it's like official today that Toronto's getting the next WNBA team, right?
Yes, it's official today. That's great news for women's sports in general, and just for the city or Ontario, Canada, or Toronto. So it's going to be very exciting. It's not until 2026, but I feel like it's a great movement for the sport of basketball and female basketball.
And you guys, I mean, when you guys were coming up, were there fewer options, like because there wasn't a team in Canada, and I guess now there's also more WNBA teams, right?
Yeah, there were fewer options growing up. I mean, even now we didn't have as many prep schools as there is in, I wouldn't say Canada, but Ontario alone. I know there's Hoop Queens now. I'm not sure if you heard of it. It's like a summer league in Canada or Toronto. So yeah, there's a lot more opportunity now than I would say when we were growing up.
Sure. What do you think we need to do to like keep that rolling?
Just keep pushing it as much as we can on TV, social media. Keep talking about it, get the awareness out there, get people watching, interested. Just talk about it. The more you talk about it, the more it's going to sell. The more other people are going to talk about it. The more other people are going to be interested. And also just like teaching the young, because they're going to grow up. So just probably installing interest in them at a young age, and then it's going to grow, bloom into something greater than it is today.
I think one of the things, that she pointed out there was like, to keep it going, we have to keep it going. Like, we can't just like be like, oh, we're good now.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's something that's like really been on my mind, because when you look at the history of like movements, of various movements, we're using the word movement and moment a lot. But like when you look at the history of this kind of stuff, I think things tend to reach a point where it's like, it's exciting and we're seeing more of whatever it is that we wanted. Like in this case, more women's sports, right? And then like you can imagine, like a couple of years ago, it was only, we only got to see women on TV 4 or 5% of the time playing sports, right? So when you bump that to 15% or 20%, that feels like women's sports are everywhere.
Sure.
But 15%, 20%, whatever it ends up being, over the next couple of years is still not 50%.
Right.
So it's like, we have to be careful to like keep things moving, like keep pushing forward.
It always reminds me of, those studies that measure, well, they're like their workplace studies, because that's where a lot of like business studies happen, because they're like easy measurable. And they'll basically ask men, like, how often do you think the women in a meeting talk? Oh. Right. And the men will be like, oh yeah, they talk 50% of the time. And then you actually measure it and it's like 30%. Right. And if you get to anywhere close to 50%, the men are like, man, the women just won't shut up. Like they just talk so much. And you're like, it's because, to your point, right? Like it's like 50% feels twice as much as 25%. Those women are talking twice as much as they used to talk. Right. Or you see it with like jobs now, right? Where like I hear like a lot of guys will be like, I can't get hired now. And it's like, well, if you look at it, like men still have, disproportionately the percentage of like high level CEO, executive positions, media jobs, whatever you want to talk about. But women are getting so many more that it feels right. Yeah. Like to go from 80% of the jobs to 60% of the jobs, that's a big drop. So so I think right now we are having this thing where like some people for sure are like, oh man, women's sport, we just hear about women's basketball all the time. But in reality, we got a season. We got one season. Okay, so what can we do to keep the movement moving forward? Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's keep watching, right? There was some there was a survey done recently by Parity, one of those firms that kind of measures women's coverage and women's media and women's sports. And overwhelmingly people start watching women's sports because they want to support women. It was like 47 or 48% of people who say they watch women's sports regularly. They start because they want to support women.
Right.
But then they keep watching because they're like, oh, Caitlin Clark's a really good player, right? Like, oh, it's actually like really exciting.
They stay because the sport is good.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's like we saw this like when we did the feisty push around like the World Championships in Kona. Yeah. Like, sure, you start from this place of like, yay, it's going to be great, women, yay. But like, why did people watch? Because it was like way better racing, right? Like it was way more exciting. So I think there's like an about where I do think we're going to have to shift some of this narrative in media away from like, eat your broccoli to like, no, actually, this is like really fun.
Yeah. I like the eat your broccoli example. like watching women's sports is not eat your broccoli.
No, it's not. No.
It's actually a good sport. Yeah. I was gonna say I almost liked seeing that. Like the Forbes top 50 top paid or 50 top paid athletes coming out and everyone commentating about how there were no women on the top 50 list, and I thought that was like I actually like really was kind of like, that's well timed because it's like while we're in the middle of this like, yay, women's sports are growing so much, it's amazing, and that's literally, I'm having so many conversations about that every day. Sure. It's like also like we're still, the female athletes still aren't paid as much, and there's still a lot of work to do. What's the state of like sponsorship prize?
Yeah, I know like there are like obviously we're now moving from the yay part of the conversation to the like, but we got to keep going part of the conversation. Yeah, it did crack me up with the when everyone kind of found out that WNBA starting salaries are $76,000, and I texted you this, right? And I was like, I appreciate everybody being worked up about that. Mm-hmm. But also, like, why did you think Brittany Griner was playing in Russia? Like, that's not something you do just for fun, right? Like, it's because she was making like $100,000 as, a superstar. Yeah. I understand. I do not at me about the economics of like capitalism. I understand that like people get paid in reflection to how much money comes in. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the WNBA is like our oldest women's sports league, like it has lasted 20 years now, 19, whatever. 20 years into the NBA, they paid a higher percentage of revenues to their players than the WNBA pays to their players.
Interesting.
They invested back more. Now the landscape was wildly different, like we just said.
Their costs different. Like there's a whole.
There's a lot of like their costs were different. Again, like sports were a smaller game back then. Like you really don't get into like the mass professionalization of men's sports until like the 80s. You know what I mean? Like what we think of as modern men's sports didn't really happen back in the day, right? It was still like very, very like low key, right? Like very, yeah.
It was the, amateurism was very much
a thing.
Like, what do you call it? Like it was celebrated.
Yeah. And it still is in some places, but like we've moved on. Yeah. Like we've moved on, and for better or worse, like we've moved on. Like we're not going, it's not going backwards now. You can't put those worms back in the can. So like the WNBA, like, yes, 100%, like people need to watch it more than like viewership. Then like if viewership follows, sponsorship dollars will follow, ad dollars will follow, and then that money will get to the player. Like absolutely 100, like totally. But also there is a difference in how like societally wise, like we view, like we often pay the male athletes disproportionately more because we like feel like they're worth it. Even if like the numbers were not there in the NBA for those players to be paid what they were paid, and yet they still were paid what they were paid. And that's true when you look at a lot of sponsorship deals, like across some of the biggest names, right? Like the men are paid what they're paid, not because like there's proof that they're going to make that company more money, just because it's more because like we're willing, and by we, I mean like society is willing to take a risk, to invest, to feel like, oh, well, like give him another chance, let him fail up. And like women, we kind of have to like prove before they will invest in us, which is a lot harder to do.
Yeah. When Sarah Spain was on the podcast here, the Women's Performance Podcast, I thought her point was very interesting. Like, it's like it's like giving your daughter $1, giving your son $10, and then coming back 3 years later and being like, why is one's business bigger than others? Right. Like, and that's kind of the same way that we've treated women's sports. Like we've always treated men's sports like a startup, right? Where it's like, oh, you have to invest to get things back, like not without this expectation necessarily of like a perfect, profitable, you know, revenue gains year on year. Whereas like with women's sports, we've oh, well, it's not profitable. They lost money, so it's not worth it. Like the expectation, the way that we kind of frame it, completely different. But I do think that that's changing.
It is changing, and I also think there's some amount now as you're seeing, as like the WNBA is about to enter its like next collective bargaining agreement. You know what I mean? And like and like salaries have consistently been bargained up as every agreement's gone on, right? And so you do expect to see that, but I think you're also seeing as some of these leagues mature, that there's this concern that like, maybe we don't have to do, like, yes, money is a good marker of success, but it doesn't have to be. And like, there's a sense among some female athletes that's like, we don't have to do things the exact same way the men have done them, right? So just because like, you know, it's a $20 million cap or whatever for the men's league doesn't mean like, maybe we're all good with 5 million. And then we can like reinvest that money into development or into childcare at the stadium or back into the community, or like maybe these leagues and these contracts can look different. And I think you're seeing, I don't think there's a model for that yet, but you are seeing some pushback, right? Like I found this very fascinating. The NWSL, the soccer league, it's probably like the next most successful like league after WNBA because like it has like reached maturity, right? Like you're actually seeing like TV deals now and contracts. And this past year when like it was trade season, some people got traded, right? Like people got like, and the outrage both from like female players and from the community was like, she has to uproot her whole life and just move. And you're like, and it was like, yeah, that's how trades work. Like that's how trades have always worked, right?
Right. Yeah.
Sure. But it was also like, wait, that's not the deal. Like that's not the deal we've made. Like that's not how we understand sports. As women, like we have always understood sports to be like kind of a collective community. Right. So that like violated our agreement. And so then it was kind of, I could see like everyone being like, wait, this is kind of fucked up actually. Do we have to do it that way? Like, could we do it a different way?
Right.
So I found that like fascinating.
I used to think that was kind of fucked up in men's sports.
Right. It is
too. Like watching like people just like at the drop of a hat have to like uproot and move their whole family somewhere, etc. Like, yeah, you're right. We could do it differently. Why not?
Why not? Yeah. So I think one of the challenges though is like there is no model for that.
Yeah. Right.
So you have to like invent it.
Yeah. We're inventing a lot of things right now. Because I feel like the point that you're making is around like, do women's sports have to like men's sports? Like it also applies to the sport itself.
Sure.
Right? Like we know that like women's basketball right now is like developing its own game, or it has been developing its own game over the last, however, couple decades. And it's like starting to look very, very different to the men's version of the sport, which again, like I'll go back to tennis because tennis has had the longest runway in terms of like actual pro players being paid consistently over decades. And people, like when I was a kid, people talked about how the women's game was different and there were more rallies and they enjoyed watching the women more sometimes. And this, like, it just developed into its own game. So I think we're going to see that, like we're seeing with basketball, we're going to see it the more that we invest in women's sports and they have their own.
Sure.
They have their own things. They also have their own things.
Their own things.
Articulate today, can't you tell? But like it does become its own thing, right? Yeah.
And like, I mean, okay, so obviously we've been talking a lot about basketball and soccer and tennis, and because those are kind of like the big global women's sports. But I feel like our bread and butter, like what we know, what our audience knows is like Olympic sports, endurance sports. And you see that in like cycling, right? Like, so like women's races have historically been a lot shorter because of men in charge and like all of that. But then they've also developed into their own thing, right? Like they've developed like punchier and more exciting, and they're also like obviously they're younger, or not like the athletes are younger. The events are younger, so it's taken a little while for teams to develop enough depth to have like full teams for multi-day events and all that kind of thing. And so you get to the question now when you're like, okay, yes, we absolutely should have like a women's Tour de France or Tour de France Femmes, right? course. And yes, we should have like multi-day races. But just because the men run 10K at cross country, does that mean the women have to run 10K, right? Mm-hmm. No, I don't like the women run 6K right now in cross country. But like, and that's a big difference. But like, just doing the men's thing isn't inherently the marker of success. Like 10K isn't automatically better than 6K. Why do we have to do their thing? They could do our thing. We have a history now at 6K. We have a history and like people who are good at it. And arguably it's probably healthier for like college kids to be running 6. What if they did our thing? Or what if we like picked a random thing in the middle? If we're all going to have to, it's the whole, like if here in California, when you go to get your marriage license, they're like, what name do you want to take? And you can pick any name in the universe. You can like make something up because like,
I love that.
Right. They like, there's this whole thing. And I was like, well, I'm not going to be the only one to change. If I have to change, you have to change. So it's like, you can just make something new. Right. And that's why I feel like a lot of times we like think we have to do the men's thing. We have to have the men's event. We have to, and I'm not saying like, of course, women should be allowed to run the marathon, right? Like that was absurd that didn't happen for so long. Mm-hmm. But in the things where there is a women's game and a women's style, and the men's isn't automatically better.
Yeah, I think your point about cross country running and the different distances, like the women traditionally did 6K, the men did 10K. I think like one of the solutions that I've seen happen here in Canada is that like you can now pick. Regardless of your gender, you can pick 6K or 10K. So everybody gets a chance to run, which then, and those are two slightly different athletes who will excel at those distances. And we're also seeing it with the Tour de France Femme. Like there's this interesting intersection between like what happens historically, how we got somewhere, and then what we actually want for the future. So you have like, we're going into the third year of the Tour de France Femme, right? And it's now 8 days. Sure. And that's mostly because the UCI was like, well, you can't have 3 weeks. Like, come on.
That'd be a lot. Like girls, be reasonable.
Like ladies, you know, like there is kind of like a negative connotation or negative reasoning behind like why the women only have an 8-day tour. But yet, like now that we're in the third year of watching that tour, people are like, this is so exciting, right? It's like, the athletes are more fresh, right? They love, like, it's like 8 days of exciting racing. And like, I have never heard anyone say like, oh, we really want to have 3 weeks, you know, because that would somehow be better. But like, part of me is like, but we do kind of want 3 weeks because we don't want the UCI to have told us that we like that women aren't as capable, and that's why we have 8 days. So I think like it's a bit of a quagmire, honestly.
It's an interesting thing, right? Because like, I mean, the cross country, right? I still race like our regional championships, and we race 1 lap and the men race 2. And you're like, I'm capable of racing 2 laps. I don't feel like inherently like there's like this thing that's like, oh, well, the women just couldn't make it through. So you're like, part of you wants to be like, no, that's stupid. But 3-week tour, there's like many, many days I won't watch because it is boring as fuck, right? Like you're just like, you do the fast forward to like you watch the last 15 seconds. Whereas like an 8-day tour, like it's exciting. So it's like maybe actually like there's a chance here. I know they're not going to do this because we're not in charge of the world, but you could like, if you were going to build something from scratch, the men could race 8 days.
The men could race 8 days.
They could race 8 days. It might be better for them. Probably less of them would dope, you know?
Yeah, they would. They wouldn't need so much HGH to get through that.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
Get through the 3 weeks, you know?
It'd be better for everybody.
Healthier for all.
I do think that's one of the, like, there are a lot of steps still to be taken, right? In like women's sports that you're saying. And like, some of it's like figuring out what we want. Some of it's like continuing media coverage. Like, yes, they like equal level athletes of ability and known famousness are paid less. Like women are paid, like I've seen it within couples where like the woman literally has lower sponsorships dollars from like than her husband for like
but she's the better known athlete.
But she's the better known athlete.
Yeah,
right?
we both know these people.
Right.
Yeah,
so it's like, and it's fascinating that when that person will say to everybody like, oh, women are paid less. And I was like, well, how do you know? And you're like, because I fucking do the books in my house, man. Like I know, like, what do you mean? How do I know? So there are all these things, but I also think like, there's also, I mean, I'm not going to say an opportunity because I hate that, but there's also like all this work being done, right? Like you're seeing like with women's like research on women's sports and like female athletes and like that, you've said this many, many times, like that's just going to like accelerate. over the next however many years as we kind of have these opportunities to know more.
Yeah. I actually find, that about how, like, basically, like, the women's performance, which is essentially why we started this podcast, right? Is that, like, we've had such a, I mean, Kelly, it's hit an inflection point. We've had such a, like, I don't know, steep on-ramp from, like, when, like, Dr. Stacey Sims was kind of the first one who put up her hand and said, well, wait, if we only study male athletes in exercise science, like, how do we know that the outcomes of the studies apply to women? Right. And that's only, like, Stacey's like 3 years older than me. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is not like my grandmother's grandmother. This is like now. And then, I'm looking at, for example, I'm always looking for people to come on the podcast or participate in some of our, like a summit perhaps for women's performance next year. So I started going to the university here in Victoria and going, like, who's doing this type of work? Like, who's actually looking at sex differences in exercise science or nutrition science or the kinds of things we want to know about in sport. And there's, like, I found all these PhD students. Like, there's all these, like, 20 somethings who are asking questions about women in relation to health, sport, exercise, fitness, all of these things. Like, and so that's like a half a generation, basically, maybe a full generation, where you go from, like, one woman putting up her hand and going, wait, something's wrong here, to, like, it being a massive area of research. So based on that, I think that we're going to see a lot of changes because the outcomes of all of those people's research are now going to be kind of, because that's how science works. Like, you don't just do one study and you're done, right? It's like study on study on study, and then you get a body of evidence for certain things around, like, how our cycles affect or hormones affect certain things related to exercise or nutrition, etc. So I do think that it's exciting.
It's interesting. The 20-somethings, it's going to all come down to you guys.
Yeah, it's Gen Z, man. You're in charge now.
Because even when we were talking about, like, media and expectations and, like, why is this moment happening right now? It's because, like, the 23-year-olds, like, they have no patience. They, like, it doesn't even. What was it? We were doing all these interviews last summer about, like, like, with the all women's Ironman World Championships coming up, with the Tour de France Femmes, like, how do we make sure that people, like, know about this and tune in and it gets the coverage it deserves? And the 24-year-old, everyone else, like, understood what we were concerned about. The 24-year-old we talked to was like, why wouldn't people watch? I don't understand your point.
Yeah. It's like, are people not going to watch?
Are people not going to watch? Why?
I mean, like, yes, I do think that there's, like, that tolerance that we kind of had because it was in the zeitgeist, younger people don't have, which I think is amazing. And also because of the work that we do in women's sports and women's health, like, every single day, we both know that there are still tons and tons of people out there, like, who come on our social media and say women's sports are boring, like, which seems to be their central point. And, like, who still really provide a lot of pushback. Like, it does not surprise me, like, when we talked about history early on, when, running certain distances were banned at some point. Like, the women's sports became too popular, too many women did them, and then the men banned them. Like, those are the same guys. Those are the same guys that are trolling our Instagram accounts.
I think they're their grandsons, but yeah.
They're the same type.
I mean, it's like, women's soccer in the UK was really, really got bigger crowds than the men's in the 20s. And why did it start? Because of the war and all that. And literally, Football Association banned women from playing on their fields. You can't, like, ban women from playing in England, but they were not allowed to play on any Football Association certified fields, which meant that they couldn't host games in stadiums for 50 fucking years, right? Like, that's crazy. Or, like, I was telling you, there's this, like, race by my house that I'm doing next weekend that's, like, the oldest trail race in the country. And back in the 20s, like, women raced it. They called it a hike because women weren't allowed to run, but they, like, raced it. And then they got banned in, like, 22, and they didn't come back until 1970. Like, that's insane. That's insane.
It is insane. And when we think about it, we think, oh, it's insane and it's in a different time. But, like, it is, but it isn't. Like, what can we learn? What can we learn from history? Because there are a significant number of people out there who are pushing back on this women's sports movement, right? So we need to be, the entire summary of my point
be vigilant.
Podcast, it's like, push on, everybody, push on, let's go.
I mean, it's fascinating because, yeah, I mean, obviously here they're not going to ban women from that race again, but you could see like there may be like you do see constantly like there are some little steps being taken back places, and obviously overall, it's a weird time.
It's a great time.
It's also a great time, right? It's also an Olympic year.
Yes.
Which is why we're doing this, because historically, Olympics has equaled women's sports. The Olympics has been the primary time that women's sports get 50% of coverage. And I know that's not like always true. And like, I know like, but when we have said women's sports, we almost always mean Olympic sports.
Well, and I always make this point, like if I'm ever asked to speak somewhere or whatever, like about like literally how I became so passionate about this is because I was this kid who was like trying to watch women's sports on TV and couldn't.
Really?
And like the only time you get to watch, when I was a kid, got to watch women's sports on TV was during the Olympic Games, because it's this 4-year cycle. And I would just be like glued to watching like the swimming and the running, the diving. So yeah, I'm so excited that we get to cover the first ever gender equal Olympic Games this year.
Yeah, we're going to be there. I did ask our basketball players again too, like, because will be at the Olympics. Basketball and soccer are still the thing where like there are fewer women's teams than men's teams that make it through. It's still like make it to the Olympics, but our Canadian women's team will be at the Olympics. So will our U.S. women's team. And I asked them kind of what they thought. Will it be different this year? Like, will it be more exciting, kind of with all of this movement?
Oh, at our Canadian, sorry, before we hear from our player, our Canadian women's senior team is going to the Olympics, and our threes team.
Oh, you're 3-on-3
too. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty different. I think just for the sole purpose of we have fans, because the last Olympics was in Japan and we didn't have any fans. So it's kind of different. You didn't get that feel of the Olympics. Yeah, we had the Olympic Village, but we weren't allowed to go watch other sports. Fans weren't allowed to come. So I think that alone will be the difference in this Olympics and last Olympics.
Yeah, what are you guys going to do like as your team celebration after you're done?
I'm not sure. I think people are going to have to come watch and find out.
So one of the things obviously that's going to be super different, and I know this, like we've been talking about women, but there were no fans in Tokyo. I mean, there were, but like there weren't.
Right.
And there obviously weren't in Beijing. So you kind of like have all this built up, pent up energy. And I think you build that on top of like all of this momentum happening. And I think it's gonna be a little crazy. I think it's gonna be like super nuts.
Do you? Like in the streets of Paris, you think it's gonna be nuts?
No, I think overall, like the general, right? Like the overall attention being paid to Olympic athletes and to specifically our female Olympic athletes is going to be next level this year. Like, obviously that always is true for the Olympics. Like you win an Olympic gold and you like have the potential to like suddenly become a household name, like for sure. But I do think that's particularly true this year. Like you think about some of the athletes that we know that like literally we just like know, and they were like, walking down the street a couple of years ago, like this was not a big deal. And I feel like they could easily become massive stars this year all of a sudden, which will be interesting.
Yeah. It's exciting. And when we're talking about Olympics, like I like looked this up again before the show, because, I was trying to remember, like, what was her name? But like in the, like women did 4 or 5 sports in the second modern Olympic Games, like in the 1900 games.
They did. Yeah. I think they called it lawn tennis, but yeah, it was like, that's what they did. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the first Olympics, there was in 1896, there were no women. 1900, there was like, I forget how many women.
It was something really small.
There was like 4 or 5 sports. So by the 1920s, there was a woman called Alice Milliet, a French woman, and she was like so annoyed that the women only got to play certain sports in the Olympics that she created her own like Olympic Games for women, and it happened in Paris, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
in Paris in 1922, and 20,000 people attended this thing. Yeah. And so like, it's things like that. That I'm like, there was like over the years, there are all these people doing all of this work. Right. And so that Women's Olympic Games ultimately did not, like, it got rolled back in to the Olympics. But like, if we're going to talk about the reasons how we got from 0 to equal numbers of women at the Olympic Games coming up this year, we have to, like, this is like 100 years of work. By a lot of women to get there.
It'll be interesting. And we obviously do have a lot planned for the Olympics this year. Along with croissants and commentary. So we'll be doing our weekly episodes here. This was kind of just our like state of the sport, but we're going to talk about like a lot of different thematic topics. We're going to talk a little more about history, some performance topics, pregnancy, mental health, diet. Like, why is that still such a big? Why are we still fucking that up? Is what I always keep coming back to.
Like it wasn't that long ago that we weren't. Like it wasn't, like I was a pro athlete for 15 years, and the entire time I was told by coaches and dietitians and to
lose weight,
cutting calories, losing weight. The entire focus of my performance nutrition was that. And it seems crazy now, but that was, that was only a decade ago.
You're like, I'm not that old.
I'm not that old, people.
We're going to be covering all that. And then, as we get close to Paris, we will be in Paris. We will be doing on the ground daily coverage. We're not totally sure exactly what it's going to look like yet, but it's going to be awesome.
I do know that we just ordered 2 full body baguette costumes.
Right. Key clutch here.
So we're not sure what's going to happen with those, but you might see us running around the streets of Paris dressed as baguettes.
There are mixed feelings about the baguette costumes. I feel like I need to say within the feisty team.
Meaning I'm bringing all the enthusiasm and everybody else is like, oh no, do I have to wear a baguette costume?
So there will be that, but also, useful information.
Useful information about the athletes and things that are going on behind the scenes.
Yes.
I'm so excited to be there.
Yeah. So we have all of that coming up. Anything else in, the state of women's sports? The state of women's sports. You know how every year the president does a State of the Union? Do they do that in Canada? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
just not called the State of the Union.
So the State of the Union. You always want to be like, the State of the Union is good.
In summary. The state of the Women's Sports Union is good. Well, how would we summarize? We've hit an inflection point.
Right. I feel like your summary is be vigilant.
Yes. Basketball's leading the way, but friends,
be vigilant.
Do not continue to push on.
I feel like that's the summary, right? Continue to push on. Women's sports are exciting. This is not like, oh man, have to watch women's basketball.
Like eating broccoli.
It's not like eating
really
broccoli.
Good sport.
Really good. And this year, I do think like if we can get through this year and next year, I do think like it's shifting. It's changing.
Yeah. And you know what else is changing? This is like we sort of touched on this, but like you're seeing so much investment being made in women's sports, and that's going to continue to pay dividends over a number of years. So that's why we're saying, per the shirt that Kelly's wearing, it's not a moment, it's a movement. That's ultimately what's going to make it a movement, is that we're going to see the return on investment that's being made now, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And so it is the momentum will be forward.
Be forward. The momentum will be forward.
In summary.
All right. I feel like that was a good first episode, everybody. Come back next week when I think we're going to talk about like the history more. I think that's what we're going to do.
Okay. I'm there for it.